Welcome everyone to the Cultural Heritage Board hearing. I'm Tricia Meyer. I'm manager of the in the planning division of the planning program section, and we're really happy that all of you are here. We were intending to have a Cultural Heritage Board hearing, an official public hearing today, but we do not have a quorum, and so that development happened in the last couple of hours, and we're unable to hold our hearing. So items that were on the agenda, besides the speaker, are going to be held until the next meeting. There won't be any official action taken at this meeting, but we are going to go ahead and host a staff workshop with our speaker today, Dr. Lily Ann Welty Tamai, and we're super excited that you're here today. I didn't actually bring her bio to read off. I don't know if you
Yeah, I'm happy to provide an introduction also.
Okay, awesome. So I'll have Dylan Murray, who heads up our Cultural Heritage Board program, provide the bio before she steps up. But thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you, Tricia. And so by way of background, Dr. Welty Tamai is an assistant professor of public history with specialization in historically underrepresented communities in the U.S. at CSU Sacramento. She is currently the co-president of the Ventura County chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League and earned a doctorate in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her forthcoming book, Military Industrial Intimacy, Mixed Race American-Japanese Eugenics and Transnational Identities, documents the history of mixed race American-Japanese born after World War II and raised during the post-war period. She co-edited Shapeshifters, Journeys Across Terrains of Race and Identity, and the special issue of the Journal of Asian American Studies, Reckoning with the Interdiscipline, the Past, Present, and Future of Asian American Studies. She previously served as the curator of history at the Japanese American National Museum and on the U.S. Census Bureau National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Welty Tamai.
Thank you so much for attending and coming. I'm so glad to have been invited, and thank you, Dylan, for inviting and really thinking about this education piece about the county landmarks and for the public. A couple of things I just want to share today. I'm going to forward, not used to the clicker, so I'm going to work on the clicker here. I wanted to just share some of my research that I've done on the cemetery, and this is as you guys saw the flyer. I'm so glad you guys came and joined here. But I just want to share a couple of things about the cemetery. This has a special place in my heart. I knew about this cemetery from driving by as a local kid. My grandmother lived in South Oxnard, and we would drive by and I would see it, and she would kind of say, that's a Japanese cemetery. And we never really stopped though, so I never had a chance to stop and look and take a peek, but I always knew exactly where it was. And so I think for many people as well, you've heard of the cemetery, maybe it's a historic landmark or county landmark. So I guess I'm just curious, how many of you guys in the audience have driven by or seen the cemetery, like physically seen it, so you kind of know what it looks like in general? Okay, so some folks. So if you haven't and you live locally, consider taking a field trip and drive by. Take a different route if you get onto the PCH and drive by and see it. So just because I think seeing it is really different. I mean, I'm showing you an image of it here, and it's this triangular shaped plot that kind of goes, it's narrow at the front and it widens out in the back. And you'll kind of see, just to kind of orient everybody on how the cemetery looks and works, is the first burials were in the back, at the widest part of the triangle, buried in the back. I guess I should use the pointer. Way back there where the trees are. And then gradually, as more people were buried, they were buried kind of chronologically in time. And so the most recent burials, which were in the 1960s, are at the very front. So there's 4 plots in the very front. And those were people who came back to Ventura County after the Japanese American incarceration. And then they were older bachelors. So those 4 men, my guess is that they likely knew each other and then were buried here. And so that's kind of how, just so you can kind of think about the cemetery itself. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about this, the cemetery, the significance, and I want to share a few stories with you. So a couple of things that I wanted to do is to talk about Just again, a little overview, the family histories and the stories, the oral histories that I was able to get by really combing for many years, lots and lots of community members and descendants who don't live around here, many of them. And so I'm going to share a couple of those stories. A couple families still do, but wanted to share that and talk about kind of the research that has taken place in order to find out a lot of this info. And then we'll do questions and answers. So that's kind of my plan here. So just a few things. This cemetery is very much a community space. And I really want to highlight that piece. Before my academic position at Sac State, I was a volunteer as part of the Japanese American Citizens League. There's me right there. And my son, who's really little at the time, he's 9 now, so this is a couple of years. This is 2017, I think. But every year, the Ventura County Japanese American Citizens League chapter, as well as with the Oxnard Buddhist Temple and other members of the community, would come annually to clean up the cemetery. And the position of the cemetery, for folks who don't know, is it's off of Edding Road and Olds Road near Pleasant Valley and the PCH out south by the on-ramp towards Point Mugu. And so this space was always kind of where, if you were coming to the Strawberry Festival in May, you'd drive on Pleasant Valley Road just behind us there, and then you'd head over to College Park. And so many people in the JCL thought, we want to make sure that people who are brand new to Oxnard, when they come through, that they're going to see a clean space, not a weedy looking, ratty cemetery. And so we would try to time our cleanups to be right before the Strawberry Festival, and it would often land on Mother's Day that weekend. And so, this is after the cleanup, and this is with just a handful of volunteers. We had more volunteers than we needed, but it was always just this wonderful community event. So I wanted to just let folks know that I didn't start off thinking, I want to do research on the space. It was always a really rooted in community. And so with this, there are these, when I started to ask around and I started attending regularly, and you can't just show up. You have to build trust, bring food, do your work, not be paid for anything. You just got to go and do all those things. So I paid my dues, and then I started kind of being nosy because I was always like, who are the people in the cemetery, right? And I'm like, are you related? Like, why are you doing this, right? Why would you, other than we want to beautify Oxnard, which we have lots of room to do that. People who attended, almost nobody knew anything about anybody buried. And many of the people who did the cleanups were not even related to anybody who were buried in the cemetery. So a lot of it just, it wasn't an ordinary kind of reason, right? And started asking around. And of course, it's that there's this connection. The Japanese American community today has, feels like they have a tremendous duty to these pioneers who had lived in this space prior to their arrival after World War II. The other thing is that the Japanese American community and in Japanese culture, cemeteries are not scary places. Cemeteries are not places that there's ghosts and boogeymen and you avoid it. No, every year your family goes to visit your ancestors right before Obon, and you clean your cemetery grave plot. You bring incense and food food in the sense of an offering, not like burgers, like you don't feed this. You bring an offering of mochi, you light incense, you clean the grave. My grandmother in Japan would pour sake sometimes across the stone, and it's this space where you go back and you remember family. And so that interesting connection. So we have that need, this duty, this obligation, or in Japanese, giri, didn't make sense to me because, nobody's related. Why are we doing this, right? This is a big thing. So it comes back down to, again, I think that there is history that has intersected and really created this kind of chasm between these generations of people who had lived in this space, in this area prior to World War II, prior to Executive Order 9066 and the Japanese American incarceration of World War II, and to the community who arrived in the aftermath. So I want to share a couple of things as I started to do research on this. And one of the graves that really stood out to me was the Nakai family grave. So this is story time. You guys ready for story time? This is where story's gonna start. So I saw this grave, and this is one of the sites, this is towards the front, so this is the 1930s when this family grave was erected. And I started thinking, okay, so Nakai family, let's look at the people, right? So one of the first things I did as a nerdy researcher was I wanted to get everybody's names, birth date of birth, date of death, any information I could find about everybody in the cemetery. So you can imagine there's 120, approximately, I've seen numbers say 130 known graves, but it seemed to have fluctuated because people were removed from those grave sites and taken to Ivy Lawn and other places. But what I do know is at one point there were around 120 graves. So we're going to start with that now. So when I started doing this, I have this giant Excel sheet and I have all this information and it's sort of just filling in squares whenever I can find info. And what I noticed about the Nakai family was that, and I know you can't really read it on the grave there, so I've kind of redone it there. Fujinosuke, the father, he dies in 1930. The younger son dies in 1933 at age 9, and then the mother dies that same year, then the oldest son dies. I kept thinking, what happened, right? And I'm searching for death records and searching for info. The only thing I can find out from oral histories as well as from descendants is that they think they must have had tuberculosis and the family just caught it and then they passed away. What we do know is that the 4 members that passed away, they have, right, we've evidence of their passing. We know that they're buried in the cemetery. There were 2 sisters who were left behind. Aiko at age 16 and Suzuko at age 9. And so by 1935, here's a family with 2 daughters left. And those 2 end up having to go to Gila River. They were relocation center in Arizona when the Japanese American community was incarcerated and removed from everywhere across the West Coast. And so I kind of tried to find was doing some digging and I found Suzuko, the younger sister. She actually never returned to Oxnard because she was a little girl when she had left. She and her sister, they go to Gila River and then she ends up going to Chicago. So like many other people in the Japanese American community, they end up moving to the Midwest and other places. And she marries her husband, Robert Alves, and she passed away. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I changed it on my bad. There's Suzuko, my bad. I'm doing 2 things because I don't know what comes next without my computer, and that one's a different. So Suzuko, she marries her husband, Robert Alves, and then I end up finding her daughter, and I'm in correspondence with her daughter, and found out more information about the family. And it turns out her daughter had said, yes, she loved her older brother, but they were never really allowed to see each other because he had to stay in the attic because he was ill. We don't know what, but I think tuberculosis, and again, I am speculating, I don't know for certain, but some kind of contagious disease where he had to be isolated. And so she said she just loved seeing him, but she couldn't see him because of his illness. And so, you think, what happens to a community that is uprooted? Who's going to take care of these 2 girls, right? There's not a lot of social services in place. But what this community did have was a lot of friends. And there was a man by the name of Shisaku Shimizu, and he was a bachelor who had known the Nakai family very well. And he had arrived in the United States in 1899 at age 24, had an 8th grade education. He was from Hiroshima Prefecture. He ported into Tacoma, Washington, and then made his way to Ventura County. And here's where he worked as a cook with the Nakai family and at a dry goods store. And Shisaku Shimizu, who died in 1941, he was 67 years old, prior to the time where the Nakai family, the 2 parents had passed away and left those girls, he kind of stepped in and took care of the girls. And when he died, the 2 sisters always said, whenever we come back to clean the graves of our parents, make sure that we clean Shimizu-san's grave too. And because he was so kind to step in and take care of us when our parents had died. And so this act of kindness, right, this act of community, kinship, of Mr. Shimizu really stood in the family lore for many, many years in the Nakai family and on to the generations that the grandchildren of the Nakai family, when they had actually come to one of the cleanups and they said, oh, my mom, and my auntie always told me, make sure you come and you clean Mr. Shimizu's grave. So this is an act of kindness from 80 some years, right? We're looking at almost 8 years ago. And the family, even in the last couple of years, has continued to do this, act of kindness of cleaning his grave, bringing flowers to his grave and making sure to do that. So I wanted to share too that for a long time, I knew this story and it just felt so touched by this, right? That here we have this, again, an act of kindness of just doing what a community would do with one another. For many years, I just thought, who was this Mr. Shimizu? And I'm not kidding, like maybe a couple weeks ago, as in preparation for this talk, I was like, wait a minute, I saw something online. I was like, that name sounds really familiar. What? And turns out there's a picture of Mr. Shisaku Shimizu, and I wanted to show you guys too, because I was shocked that this even existed, that this survived. Here he is, looks like a man with a very slight build, in the Takeda family store in Oxnard, on Oxnard Boulevard, or I believe it's 7th Street in 1914. And this is the man who ended up, several decades later, helping to care for 2 little girls who, not, so little, but 2 girls who really needed support at a time when there wasn't a lot of support in the community and there was growing anti-Japanese racism. So that's the first story I want to share with you. I think one of the best stories in a lot of ways, because the research has finally shown us what he looks like, and I feel like we have to honor his kindness so many years later. The next story I want to share with you is a story of a baby. One of the things that I had thought as I was doing research for the cemetery was that, wow, all of these people, maybe they were adults when they died. Turns out a lot of the people buried in the cemetery were actually babies and infants because, number one, there's high rates of infant mortality in the early 20th century. And you don't have all the kinds of ways you can support families and families in this era, but also that there were, young Japanese American couples who were finally able to form families. And so one is of the Otani family. If this name sounds familiar to you, which I think y'all know, there is the Otani seafood in Oxnard, and yes, they are connected. And so I want to share a little bit about this. And I started again because of my research skills / obsession for finding out information and details about the cemetery, the people interred in the cemetery. I started again, not only putting in birth and death dates as best as I could, but also figuring out the age of death. And so again, this is where, there's 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 6-month-old babies. And Hifumi Otani was one of those individuals. Hifumi Otani was one of the young children of a couple, Toraichi Otani and his wife Shina. They too had left Hiroshima Prefecture. Many Japanese immigrants were from Hiroshima and other southern parts of Japan, who had ended up in this area. And Toraichi and Shina, they had a general store and a barber shop and they lived at 620 Oxnard Boulevard, and their store was on the first floor, and they lived on the second floor. And they had tried all kinds of businesses, running a pool hall, a bathhouse, and all of these barbershop as well. All of these businesses really catered to the growing Japanese American migrant population who lived in the area at the time. By 1899, right around the eve of the incorporation of the city of Oxnard, there were about 1,000 Japanese migrant laborers. Many of these young men, most of the men, had come. They were able-bodied, late teens, early 20s, had come kind of like Shisaku Shimizu to come to work, and they were called buranke katsuji, which is a term for people who were bedroll carriers. So they would just migrate with the seasons wherever, you pick deciduous fruits in Northern California, you harvest row crops in Southern California, maybe do cannery work on the coast, you're moving along. And so by this time, the Otani family, by 1910, the Toriichi and Shina were running these stores, trying to figure out what business would work to cater to this local population. And their son was just 6 months old when he passed away, and they buried him in the cemetery. And again, I will connect all the historic pieces, but Japanese Americans were not allowed to be buried anywhere else because even though California was not a segregated slave state, we operated with many of those ideals about separating the races, both in life and in death. And so the cemetery, Japanese American cemetery, was the only place where they could bury their children. Toriichi and Shina were Christians, and so even though they could have been buried in other cemeteries, it wasn't a religious-based cemetery or anything like that. It was kind of anybody who was Japanese American, Japanese descent. And so Toriichi and Shina, they just couldn't start a family, and they really wanted to figure out what they could do to resolve this. And so they decided that they would see a Buddhist priest. And so it's kind of interesting, this kind of interesting cross-pollination of cultural connections. And the priests told them, name your next child Izuto, and the baby will survive. And, they did what they were told. They took the priest's recommendations. And 2 years later, Izuto Izzy Otani was born. And then later, after Izuto's birth, they had 2 other sons and 2 daughters. And so they were really able to successfully start their family. And as we know, the Otani family has continued to be one of the longest, have one of the longest businesses in Oxnard. This is Izuto Otani. This is Izuto Otani with his family. This is in 1942 on the eve of World War II. Well, World War II has already begun, but on the eve of their departure from Ventura County, from Oxnard, to go to Gila River. And so they're nicely dressed because many Japanese Americans, prior to their departure, wore their best clothing in preparation to go to a place they didn't know, which ended up being one of the 10 relocation centers on the interior part of the country. And so the Otani family has continued their tradition, and I will let you guys take a look and check out their restaurant if you were so interested. The other thing I wanted to share, and just to think about this connection of the cemetery, and I want to start off with a couple stories, but I also want to start off with this interesting timeline of what has transpired in the last century. We do know that this historic Japanese cemetery, as I mentioned, they were racially segregated. The Wainimi Masonic Association, which had a cemetery just beyond the row of eucalyptus trees. Let me go back on that slide to show you guys. Just beyond the eucalyptus trees back there is a second cemetery, which was much older cemetery. Historic landmark? No, not a historic landmark. But maybe, we'll see. The Wainimi Masonic Association had a cemetery already, and they said, sure, we would, we have to figure out, Japanese Americans were trying to figure out where to bury their deceased once they started to have a need to bury their deceased. And so in 1908, and prior to that, the Wainimi Masons and the Japanese American community had figured out to place the Japanese Americans in this plot. And I'll tell you guys a little bit more about the details of that. This is foreshadowing. The details about the plot and what they paid in comparison to people who were not Japanese. We do know that by 1960, that was the last known burial. Matsutaro Imagawa, who is 93 years old, which is significant, right, to be able to live that long at this time. In 1971, the historic cemetery receives county designation at landmark number 18. And that didn't just happen out of the goodness of the hearts of the folks here at the county, right? It took the community to really push to help to make that happen. Because these things, right, for preservation, this stuff, as you guys know, doesn't happen without a lot of community support as well. And so the Japanese Cemetery Association which was made up of many second-generation Japanese American Nisei, including Nao Takasugi, former mayor of Oxnard, and many others, many descendants of the cemetery. They helped to really, they organized. That I think is one of the things that was key here, and they also did cleanups. I don't know how regularly that is still research I need to find out more about. But we do know they were writing letters to the Cultural Heritage Board at that time. I looked at the records. What we know is that they were really trying to do what they could to help connect to preserving this space. And what we know is, and I'll talk a little bit about the vandalism in a moment. The other thing that we know is this is just kind of the thing that the numbers are a little fuzzy, and I some of these are a little bit, they're estimations just because the markers may have already been lost because of weather. Some graves at the time, like I said, it was about 120, 130. I've seen all the numbers. Some people were removed and then taken to other cemeteries. And what we also know is that even though the discussion in this presentation is really about the cemetery, what we have to remember is that cemetery was a part of this larger community. And the really unique thing about this community, because of Executive Order 9066 in 1942, the Japanese American community here was removed. Almost 500 of them. Most had lived in Oxnard, a handful lived in Ventura, Santa Paula. They were removed from this area and sent elsewhere. And a trickle came back to Ventura County. And in the meantime, they were trying to reestablish their businesses, get housing once again, that the cemetery kind of falls, in a little bit of disrepair because, again, they weren't here to take care of, right? Do annual visits, clean their family's grave sites, right? People, some of the deceased and who are interned in the cemetery were bachelors. They didn't have descendants to care for their gravesite. So it really is this interesting community space where, because of World War II incarceration and because of wartime hysteria against Japanese Americans and that removal, this kind of gets, really the area gets silenced, and this cemetery just becomes, part of South Oxnard and another space to ignore. The interesting thing I think about Oxnard Cemetery and Oxnard's Japanese American community pre-war, we were part of this larger, thriving Japantown. There were many Japantowns across California. I'm changing it on one and forgot to do the other. There were thriving Japantowns all across California. You think, like, really, Guadalupe, Lompoc? Yes, George Aratani lived in Guadalupe. He's one of the founders of Mikasa and a big donor in the Japanese American community. But today, there's only 3 Japantowns left. San Francisco, San Jose, and Los Angeles. The others are just kind of shells of what they used to be. And Oxnard is one of those, one of the Japantowns that existed. And so when I started to do this research, again, there's not a ton of information, and I really kind of had to comb through a lot of archives. And that part, I think, to me as a historian, is really the fun part. I was able to recognize, too, the importance of labor in the area. The famous Oxnard beat strike in 1903 and the Japanese-Mexican Labor Association highlighted a lot of this intercultural, interethnic solidarity and cooperation in this area, because Japanese, Asians, and Latinos always worked side by side. We had this connection in these relationships. We also know that one of the big markets that helped to provide not only food and goods, but also information about jobs and gossip from back home in Japan was Asahi Market, which still stands on Oxnard Boulevard at the corner of 7th Street. This is a place where the Takasugi family had started the Asahi Market, and it's still in existence. It has changed ownership, but still is in existence today. I also just want to make sure, time-wise, we have some
Yeah.
time?
We're great.
We're still good on time. Okay. Because I have lots of stories, but I will I will exercise restraint and I will go into all the detail, but I can't. Well, I am actually writing a lot of these things. I've been in an article that I'm going to submit to the Public Historian, a journal about a lot of the public history because of the lack and the importance of ethnic public history in important spaces. So, but I will just show you guys a lot of pictures because you get to see all the photos. The other piece that I also wanted to share to connect the Japanese American community, and again, its importance within and its connection to the cemetery, is the funeral of a little girl by the name of Akiko Tagami. And so if you're folks who may know Oxnard, you would maybe know that this is Pleasant Valley Road looking east. If you were to keep going straight, you would hit the PCH. At that time, the PCH wasn't what we know what it looks like today. But this is a funeral procession for Akiko Tagami. She was 15 months old and she died of accidental poisoning. And the Tagami family, as you can imagine, were devastated by this, and many people in the community had come out to honor the family. And this is a picture, one of the few photos of a funeral that we know. And this is actually in the landmark number 18 file. There's an image of this, but I know that this is actually a scan of a photo, so it is not that great, but this is a grieving family and a community trying to make sense of what had happened. We also know a Buddhist priest, 20 adults and several children posed in front of the gravesite. And we know that many wore Western style hats and they were dressed in formal black clothing. And what I want to show you is the image that's a little bit clearer than this one. And it's the same image, just close up on the people. And I will point out, there's a little girl pictured here. This is Hanako Kato. And the Tagami family, she ended up marrying with the Kato family. And she later becomes the mother of former mayor of Oxnard, Tsujio Kato. And then that's her brother there, who's there. And it's their sibling who had passed away in this accidental poisoning. And so it's one of the few that we know that we've had many community members come and share their grief and solidarity together. This is the community again who lived and works in conjunction with each other, really working to support a growing community. Japanese Americans were able to marry because of the 1907, 1908 gentleman's agreement that allowed the wives of laborers to join them in the United States, and women were allowed to immigrate, allowing the Japanese American community to form families. This is unlike the Chinese American community who had completely excluded women and then excluded the entire community altogether. So although they were here in larger numbers in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, they were really excluded and just couldn't put down roots and bear a second generation in large number the way that the Japanese American community did. And so the Japanese American community, and Oxnard is just one small kind of view of that, they were able to form families and open businesses, and many lived, and this is on Oxnard Boulevard looking north, and there is the Asahi Market with a different frontal facade. The facade is a little bit different, but many of them, because of racist housing covenants and just the inability to kind of, they were not welcome in other parts of cities, right? And this is kind of part of the reason why we have these ethnic enclaves where we have high concentrations of people of the same ethnic group in one space. They had their businesses in the front, lived and worked either behind the building or up on the second floor. This is the next photo I want to show you is of the Takasugi family in front of Asahi Market. And so that's another family that is very well known. Now Takasugi later becomes the mayor of Oxnard. We had, really the benefit of having a stable community that allowed for these businesses to thrive. And this is the 7th and Oxnard Boulevard corner. That kind of looks a little bit more like what we know today. But But Japanese Americans, I think one of the challenging things about them really being able to find success, which I think is a part of the American dream, was that they seem to be a threat to white farmers in California in particular. California, this is from Roger Daniels' book, Politics of Prejudice, and California was an exporter of produce as we are today, but at that time, by 1919, nearly 750 million Japanese American farmers grew 10% of that. So this is statewide, not just Ventura County, but statewide. Even though they were just a tiny portion of the population, they often threatened a lot of, right, their success often threatened other farmers. And we have this really growing, I'm gonna skip the next slide. That's a little more than you guys need to know at this time. But there is this growing anti-Japanese sentiment, and a lot of that is on the West Coast and in California. And we have this growing wartime hysteria that is really preventing folks from really being able to embrace their Japanese neighbors and other Asian neighbors. And what we have is kind of legislation that is starting to say, right, define whiteness and define who gets to stay in the United States, who gets to immigrate in the United States. And ultimately, we have this arc of the anti-Asian movement from the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way to Executive Order 9066, emptying out, which then empties out the Japantowns on the West Coast. These other legislation is just other things because I teach history, so I can't help it. So here is the other stuff there. The other kind of images I wanted to show you guys, and I wanted to just kind of I'm going to skip a couple just to look at our community itself, but just so you can kind of see how robust the Japanese American community was. Not only were they working, but they were also celebrating together. This is the Kumamoto Prefectural Association, and this is at Wainimi Beach. It says Oxnard, Wainimi Beach in Oxnard, and that's just what they wrote. I'm just translating literally at the bottom in Japanese. This is from the Museum of Ventura County's archives. But they would do sumo wrestling, and another image of another Japanese American gathering at Limonera in Santa Paula, looking at this big picnic and the Japanese American community with their children, right? They have their families, they're really establishing themselves. By 1930, we also have in this area sport fishing right at the site of the Point Mugu Naval Base. It is a really deep port, and you could actually do sport fishing from the pier. In the 1930s, it hadn't been taken over by the military base at that time, and so many Japanese Americans had capitalized on being able to bring people from other areas in California and even from Japan, and they would fish. In 1940, I believe it was, or it could be early 41, but right at the eve of World War II, Mr. Kubota actually took his profit, sold the business, and went back to Japan. So he was not incarcerated and didn't necessarily lose his business. But not everybody was as lucky to be able to kind of get away from the growing anti-Japanese sentiment. This is a picture of the Women's Association at the Buddhist Church in Oxnard, and a lot of them really participating in community activities. The Women's Club highlighting that there were different activities from the men's group, and this is the men's group in front of the Buddhist Church of Oxnard. We also know that to another, skip the next one. This is just kind of to showcase this growing anti-Japanese sentiment in the 1930s. So a lot of this makes sense, right? That we have, anti-Asian sentiment brewing not only on this side of the border, but also even in Mexico. And then by 1940, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan kind of consolidates people's images of Asians as potentially threats, and all of the brewing anti-Asian animosity from decades prior could allow folks to say, yes, these people who are, citizens, neighbors, business owners, grandpas, moms, that they are threats to the nation and they should be placed in incarceration camps in the interior. So there's this, right, that he even here ended up with that same kind of sentiment. And our country, right, are arguably the most influential president of the 20th century, FDR, signs Executive Order 9066, and all Japanese Americans have to be relocated to the interior, including people from Oxnard, like the Otani family and many of the others. Most of the Japanese Americans in this area ended up in Gila River, and this is a picture of the Gila River War Relocation Center. Gila River is one of the only, it is actually the only Native American reservation where a Japanese American War Relocation Center was located. So you have a population who is discriminated, right, the Gila River Indians, and then we place another prison inside their reservation. So does this kind of really lots of things happening in terms of what we permitted at that time. So I think for me, and as a researcher, and I wanted to give you guys some of that background and some of that information, and I hope this was interesting to all of you. The part that I find, and this is where I want to go into just a little bit of the research that I have done on the businesses, and to talk a little bit about what do we do with a lot of this info, and how do we make it make sense? And so one of the things that I wanted to do was, again, figure out a discussion about this cemetery, find out who the people were, find out what happened, where did they go, where did their descendants go? But also that led me to, wait a minute, who were they before everybody got relocated, right? Who were they? What did they do? And so there's a wonderful website called CaliforniaJapantowns.org, and they have gone through and combed through a lot of historic data, and you can check out any of those Japantowns that have existed pre-war, and they've done their best to try to find out information about the businesses and anybody who had done anything in those spaces. And one of the things that I found was that they've got great data and addresses. And so I took their data and I merged it with data from looking through the phone book. Like, I went to the Oxnard Public Library. Thank goodness they have all the phone books from the start of the beginnings of the incorporation of the city. And I went through the phone book and I just wrote down, typed in any name that looked Asian, like Japanese or Chinese. I put all the names in. And turns out, right, well, what do you do with all this data? Well, thank goodness for large search engines. I took the data and I mapped it. And we could see where in Oxnard today, this is Oxnard Boulevard. If you just put in historic addresses, put it into this search engine, which I think you guys know what it is, put in a search engine, and you can see where all these places were: cleaners, bathhouses, barbershops, billiard halls, young men and women's Buddhist association, nurseries, fruit stores, all kinds of things. And so you find out, right, that of course, right, this checks with where we know Japanese Americans were allowed to live, right, or where they lived and in the city at the time. The Japanese American community also has these farmers' almanacs and all these kinds of things, and so you can kind of cross-check. So it's just a little tedious. And again, I've just really enjoyed doing this. I have this Excel sheet and I've just filled it all in. But one of the things in my archival research that has really come to be really fruitful in terms of being able to say with confidence that we do know that this was a segregated cemetery. We do know that the Japanese Americans actually paid more to be buried in the cemetery is the receipt book. We literally have receipts. At the Museum of Ventura County, they have a box of archival material on the receipts from the Waitangi Masonic Association, Cemetery Association, and Japanese Americans paid 5 times the amount to be buried in the cemetery, right? Rather than $5 a plot, they paid $25 a plot. And that was a lot of money for people back then. And you can imagine many of these are migrant laborers. They're young families who have a 6-month-old who just passed, and they have to pay a lot more. And we know that they, it was the Japanese section. Well, no, it was a completely separate cemetery. And so this is really, I think, allowing us to say in a lot of ways, and I've looked and looked, and I found a lot of information about segregated Asian cemeteries in the United States. There's Asian sections, but not segregated Asian cemeteries like this one, that it's clearly marked. Clearly they paid more. Clearly they did. It was a very different sentiment. Certainly the era and the time, and no one is saying anybody did anything, but it is interesting to see here that we can say with confidence that this cemetery really does have a lot of significance. I want to show you guys a couple aerial views and then kind of where we are today, and then I'll wrap up my talk. And then we can talk about questions. I think, do we have time for questions?
We do.
We do? Okay, great, good, because I'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts. This is an aerial view of the cemetery. So you can see what this is. So here is the Masonic cemetery here. This is the row of eucalyptus trees that was always in all the pictures. And this little tiny section, almost like 0.3 acres, is the Japanese cemetery in the very front there. The community has done a really good job of trying to figure out who is who. And so we've had a lot of community archives, and people put their ability to use old school CAD and right, to figure out who is buried where as best they could. But the problem with Japanese names is that the way that it's written, sometimes the pronunciation could be different. So it could say Rokuichi, but it could also be Mutsuichi, right? So it could be pronounced differently, and we can only kind of guess as to the pronunciation. I want to show you an image of the cemetery in about the 1980s. Before the wrought iron fencing and before the widening of the road. There's the eucalyptus trees back there, and this is kind of where the Tamai family was in that funeral picture there. Ocean View Junior High School is up Eddy Road along that way there. There's a couple of images too, and some of the ways in which I think the research, the internet has really helped with a lot of the research is that we know that there's a site called findagrave.com, and I have to say thank you to whoever the people are that go and take photos of random graves, and then they post them, and then you have images and you can kind of see who these folks are and what the cemetery looked like at that snapshot in time. So I've used all kinds of ways to figure out and triangulate information. This is Sugeichi Fujikawa, who was a restaurant keeper, and I think he's one of the only ones that actually has an image, a photo of himself in his on his headstone. The other images that I found are other ways of finding out information about the people were using World War I and World War II draft cards. Those are all on Ancestry.com and other immigration records. And so there's lots of databases out there. You just have to figure out which ones they are. So we find out some folks, sometimes they sign, sometimes I don't know that they are the ones signing the forms, but it's still kind of interesting to see. A couple more images of the cemetery when it was really late, with lots of weeds, and that's why all those cleanups were necessary. But again, for so many decades, the Japanese American community wasn't here to clean up. Today, this is not today, but within the last handful of years, I know, this is a picture prior. There was a vandalism in 2017, and I'll show you the image of that. But this is again that frontal view of the cemetery. One of the interesting things too is in 2017, I don't know if you guys remember that game, Pokemon Go. It was that digital geocaching game. Okay, so I signed up, not because I'm like into that or anything like that, but because the cemetery was a site for one of the Pokemon Go like gyms where they would like fight each other. I know this is more TMI, but my husband was like, hey, there's all these people right by the cemetery. It's like 7 p.m. It's all these like junior high kids, and they're like all on their phones, and I'm like, what is happening? So I was like, what's this? So I go and I get an account, so that's my avatar. Anyway, long story short, they're like it's these sites where like other Pokemon would come out and you would like fight them. So it does have kind of contemporary significance, I think, for younger folks, people who probably would have never been near that cemetery. And so that's kind of an interesting aspect. So that's the Eddy Road looking up Pleasant Valley Road. Another image, and this is not as with such a high tone, but in 2017 there was a vandalism at the cemetery where someone who we believe may have been under the influence of some kind of drugs or something like that came and pushed over a bunch of the gravestones, knocking them down, breaking them, and pulling out the posts. And many of those posts had been there for decades, and so the posts were rotted, and so we couldn't put them back. And so the Japanese American community has worked to, after this, we set up the JCL local chapter had set up a GoFundMe, and we raised a lot of money to help to try to clean up and redo the posts. And so what we've done is, what we hope to do is, this year is the 115th anniversary of the cemetery. We hope to do some kind of rededication and to try to, we've made repairs since. I apologize, I don't have a recent photo. We don't have a recent photo, but we do have, let's see here, I have a couple of the other photos. Well, I'll show you guys in just a moment, but I don't have the ones of the new concrete posts. So they poured concrete and then we redid the plaques. So everything is like stone, concrete, kind of weatherproof for a while. And so that's kind of what our goal is. The other thing that we'd like to do is perhaps maybe see about higher levels of designation and preservation protection. We'd like to get, I would like to further look at looking at federal census data from the 1900s and 1910 era, so we can find out more about other people who may have been connected to the cemetery. In addition, look at other leads, and then hopefully rededicate the cemetery. The other thing I wanted to share, I wanted to share a picture of the Nakai family. There's the Nakai family. So this is the Nakai family at one of the cleanups. This is the grandchildren of the Nakais, and they so lovingly always come and they bring flowers to Shisaku Shimizu's grave, which is just beyond this one. Let me show you my pointer here. So there's the Nakai family grave here, and then I believe Shisaku Shimizu's grave is right there. So they always bring they always bring flowers and help out there. The other thing I wanted to share, just to give you guys not really update, but share about the Otani family. I talked about Shisaku Shimizu, but Otani's fish market had continued, and the Otani family is still going strong. Despite those early difficulties in getting their family started, they've continued on. And the other is, of course, the Kato family, who is the folks who were connected to Akiko Tagami, the little girl who passed away. Her older sister married with the Kato family and later became the mother of the future Oxnard mayor, Tsujio Kato, and he's one of the founders of the California Strawberry Festival, of which we are so proud of today. The other is some kind of more recent photos of Asahi Market, and that is still going strong there in Oxnard Boulevard, and that's that whole road that had previously been many Japanese businesses. So with that, I think I can stop here and just say thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you for letting me share about the cemetery today. So thank you.